Have you ever wondered how the Vikings, known for their fierce raids, also managed to establish thriving settlements across vast distances? Dive into the history of Viking exploration and expansion and discover their remarkable seafaring skills, cultural impact, and the secrets behind their successful voyages. Hey guys, tonight we're sailing into the misty fjords of Scandinavia, where bearded warriors with horned helmets, actually, that's myth number one we'll debunk tonight, prepare their longships for journeys across uncharted waters. You can almost feel the cold spray of North Sea water on your face as wooden vessels creak and groan, their dragon-headed prows cutting through waves toward distant shores. If you were actually there, you probably wouldn't survive the journey. Between the scurvy, the storms, and the occasional mutiny when supplies ran low, Viking exploration wasn't exactly a luxury cruise. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, why not post your location and local time in the comments? I'm always curious where my sleep-seeking friends are drifting off from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story of Viking expansion begins not with a bang, but with a whisper of discontent across the cold northern reaches of Europe in the 8th century. You're living in a time of climate change, but not the kind we worry about today. The Northern Hemisphere is experiencing what historians call the medieval warm period. And while that might sound pleasant, it's causing some serious problems in Scandinavia. This warming trend is actually making farming more viable in these northern regions, leading to population growth, which means more mouths to feed and more young men looking for land and fortune. You're standing in a coastal village in present-day Norway around the year 790 CE. The fjords around you are breathtaking, steep cliffs diving into deep blue waters. But beautiful scenery doesn't fill stomachs. The land here is mostly rocky and infertile, with only small patches suitable for growing crops. The warming climate has helped, but there's still not enough arable land to go around. Inheritance customs dictate that only the eldest son receives the family farm, leaving younger sons with limited options. You can almost feel the restlessness in the air, the hunger for something more. Political changes are brewing too. Local chieftains are consolidating power, pushing out smaller landholders and creating tension throughout society. You might have been a free farmer yesterday, but today you're facing a choice. Submit to a powerful jarl. That's a Norse nobleman, not the stuff you spread on your toast, or seek your fortune elsewhere. It's worth noting that Vikings weren't actually a distinct ethnic group, contrary to what your high school history teacher might have told you. The term Viking was more of a job description than an identity. It comes from the Old Norse word Vikingur, which essentially meant pirate or raider. So when someone went Viking, they were heading out on an expedition for plunder. Not all Norsemen were Vikings, just like not all Americans are cowboys, though both make for better HBO series than, say, Norse Farmers, The Grain Chronicles. You've heard stories of lands to the west and south, places with milder weather, fertile soil, and monasteries filled with gold and silver, and those fancy illuminated manuscripts that make excellent kindling when you're cold. Monasteries, it turns out, were the ancient equivalent of unguarded ATMs, filled with valuable items and typically defended by men who had taken vows of non-violence. Talk about a target-rich environment. The first documented Viking raid took place in 793 CE at the monastery of Lindisfarne, a small island off the northeast coast of England. You can imagine the shock of the peaceful monks as dragon-headed ships appeared on the horizon one misty morning. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle later recorded, "In this year, dire portents appeared over Northumbria, and the ravaging of heathen men destroyed God's church at Lindisfarne through brutal robbery and slaughter." Not exactly a 5-star Yelp review of the Viking visit. Historians still argue whether environmental pressures, population growth, political upheaval, or simple opportunism was the primary driver of Viking expansion. Like most complex historical developments, it was likely a combination of all these factors, plus the fact that someone finally figured out how to build ships that could navigate the treacherous North Atlantic while carrying enough warriors and supplies to make the journey worthwhile. What's particularly interesting is that you're living in a time before the unified nations of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden existed as we know them today. Instead, these regions consisted of numerous small kingdoms and chieftainships, often in conflict with one another. This political fragmentation may have actually accelerated outward expansion, as ambitious leaders sought resources and prestige abroad that they couldn't achieve at home. One quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into the history books. Viking navigational techniques included what modern scientists call a sunstone, a crystal of Iceland spar, calcite, that could help determine the position of the sun even on cloudy days by polarizing light. You're essentially using polarized sunglasses technology to navigate across the Atlantic Ocean in the 9th century. Who needs GPS when you've got rocks with special powers? As you stand at the edge of the fjord, watching, the shipwrights hammer and shape the wooden planks of what will become a longship, you can sense that something momentous is brewing. The Norse people are about to embark on one of history's most remarkable periods of exploration and expansion, reaching lands no European had ever seen before, establishing trade networks that would connect distant cultures, and leaving an indelible mark on the world that would last for centuries. The stage is set for what historians would later call the Viking Age, a period spanning roughly from the late 8th century to the mid-11th century, when Norse seafarers would strike fear into the hearts of coastal communities across Europe, establish settlements as far away as North America, and fundamentally alter the course of medieval history. And you, my sleepy friend, have a front row seat to the whole grand, violent, transformative spectacle, from the safety of your pillow, of course. The secret to Viking success wasn't just their warrior spirit or desperate need for new lands. It was their ships. As you run your hand along the smooth wooden hull of a completed longship, you can feel the craftsmanship in every plank, every joint. These vessels weren't just transportation. They were the technological marvel of their age, the spacecraft of the medieval world, allowing Norse explorers to go where no European had gone before. Well, except for those pesky Irish monks who somehow managed to reach Iceland first in their leather boats, though they probably spent the entire journey praying rather than rowing, which might explain why they didn't write more bestsellers about their adventures. Viking shipbuilding represents one of the most sophisticated technologies of the early medieval period. You're witnessing the culmination of generations of maritime knowledge, perfected through trial, error, and probably quite a few watery graves. The longship's design solves multiple problems simultaneously. It's shallow enough to navigate rivers and beach directly on shores, yet sturdy enough to handle the punishing waves of the North Atlantic. The construction begins with the keel, the backbone of the ship. Shipwrights select a single piece of oak, usually from a tree that's been growing for at least a century. This massive timber, sometimes over 70 feet long, will form the foundation upon which everything else depends. The Vikings use a technique called clinker, or lapstrake building, where wooden planks overlap each other like roof shingles. Each plank is shaped by hand using axes, not saws, creating a hull that's remarkably flexible, able to ride over waves rather than cut through them. It's basically the medieval equivalent of full suspension mountain biking across the ocean. You notice there are no written plans or blueprints. All this knowledge is passed down through apprenticeship and oral tradition. Shipwrights judge measurements by eye and experience, using their bodies as measuring tools. Fingers, hands, arms, and feet provide the units. This organic approach to engineering somehow produces vessels with near-perfect symmetry and balance. The most distinctive feature is, of course, the dragon head, or sometimes other animal heads, carved into the prow. These weren't just decorative, though they certainly looked impressive enough to give coastal villagers nightmares. The figureheads served a spiritual purpose, protecting the crew from sea monsters and evil spirits. When approaching home shores or friendly territories, These heads were often removed as a sign of peaceful intentions. It was the Viking version of holstering your weapon. See? My dragon is in my bag. We're just here to trade. Honestly, what truly sets the longship apart from earlier vessels is its combination of sail and oars. You can see how this dual propulsion system gives unprecedented versatility. When the wind is favorable, the large square sail provides impressive speed with minimal effort from the crew. When the wind dies or shifts unfavorably, or when navigating narrow rivers and fjords, the oars come into play. A typical longship might have 16 to 50 oars, depending on its size, with each oar operated by one man, which means these ships could move at decent speeds, even when completely becalmed. The mainstream historical fact that even casual history buffs probably know is that longships were incredibly fast for their time. Archaeological reconstructions and modern replicas have demonstrated speeds of up to 15 knots under sail. That's about 17 mph or 28 km/h. To put that in perspective, Columbus's Santa Maria, sailing almost 700 years later, probably maxed out at about 8 knots. You're looking at the Formula One cars of the medieval sea. Here's a quirky tidbit most people don't know. Viking ships didn't have decks as we understand them today. Most of the vessel was open to the elements, with small raised platforms at the bow and stern. This meant that for weeks or even months, Viking crews lived, slept, and ate in what was essentially a partially flooded wooden bowl, constantly exposed to rain, spray, and occasionally massive North Atlantic waves. Each crew member was allocated a sea chest that served as seat, storage, and sleeping platform. Privacy consisted of pulling your cloak over your head and pretending not to hear your shipmates snoring. Or worse, digestive reactions to weeks of preserved fish and sour milk. You watch as the shipwrights perform a crucial step in the construction process, treating the wood with a mixture of animal hair, moss, and tar to make the hull watertight. The pungent smell of hot tar fills your nostrils as workers carefully pack this mixture into every seam. It's not a pleasant aroma, but it's the smell of maritime innovation. Historians still argue about exactly how Vikings navigated the open ocean. They had no compass, no astrolabe, and no sextant. They relied primarily on the sun and stars, coastal landmarks, the flight patterns of birds, and deep knowledge of ocean currents and wind patterns. The previously mentioned sunstone may have helped on cloudy days, but much of their navigational ability seems to have been based on experience and observation rather than instruments. Imagine crossing the North Atlantic using mainly your eyes and intuition. It's like trying to drive from New York to Los Angeles without GPS, road signs, or maps, just a vague understanding that the sun sets in the direction you want to go. The effectiveness of these ships can't be overstated. They enabled Vikings to strike with unprecedented speed and retreat before organized resistance could be mounted. A fleet of longships could appear on the horizon at dawn, raid a settlement, and be gone by midday, laden with plunder and captives. But their value extended far beyond raiding. They were the lifeline that connected distant Viking settlements, the trading vessels that carried goods across northern Europe, and the exploration vehicles that allowed Norse adventurers to reach Greenland and North America. The longships carried more than just warriors and traders. They transported an entire culture across vast distances. The distinctive Norse artistic styles, religious practices, and social structures spread wherever these vessels could reach. As you watch a completed ship being launched into the fjord, its dragon head gleaming with fresh paint and gold leaf, you're witnessing the vehicle that would carry Viking influence across half the known world, and into parts of the unknown world as well. Perhaps most impressively, all this nautical technology was developed by people commonly dismissed as barbarians by their contemporaries. While the educated elites of continental Europe were writing treatises on theology, these supposedly uncivilized northerners were solving complex problems of naval architecture and navigation that wouldn't be matched for centuries. It just goes to show that history's barbarians often turn out to be innovators who simply didn't bother writing down how clever they were. They were too busy using their innovations to change the world. These magnificent vessels wouldn't stay in home waters for long. As the 8th century draws to a close, you're witnessing the beginning of a phenomenon that will reshape European history. The ships that were built with such care and ingenuity in the sheltered fjords of Scandinavia are about to announce their presence to an unsuspecting world in the most dramatic way possible. The year is 793 CE. You're standing on the holy island of Lindisfarne, just off the northeastern coast of England. It's a peaceful early summer morning at one of Britain's most sacred Christian sites, a monastery founded in the 7th century that has become famous throughout Christendom for its religious scholarship and beautiful illuminated manuscripts. The monks are going about their daily routines, praying, copying texts, tending their gardens, when suddenly shouts of alarm ring out. On the horizon, strange ships with carved animal heads and striped sails are approaching rapidly. Within minutes, warriors wielding axes and swords are pouring onto the beach. What happens next is recorded by the Anglo-Saxon chronicler Alcuin, who wrote that, "The church of St. Cuthbert is spattered with the blood of the priests of God, stripped of all its furnishings, exposed to the plundering of pagans, a place more sacred than any in Britain." The Vikings have announced their arrival on the European stage, and they've done it with a performance that will terrify audiences for generations to come. This attack on Lindisfarne shocked the Christian world not just for its violence, but for its sacrilege. You have to understand that monasteries in this period were considered sacred ground, protected by divine law if not earthly defenses. The idea that anyone would dare to attack such holy places was almost inconceivable. It would be like someone robbing a nuclear power plant today. Not just dangerous, but breaking a fundamental taboo. The Vikings, however, operated under a different religious system entirely, and saw these wealthy, undefended religious communities as simply ideal targets. What made these raids particularly terrifying was their unpredictability. Thanks to those remarkable longships, Viking raiders could strike anywhere with a coastline or navigable river, which in medieval Europe meant practically everywhere. No warning system existed. No coastal radar tracked approaching vessels. You might be enjoying a perfectly ordinary market day in your coastal town when dragon-headed ships suddenly appeared on the horizon, bringing chaos and violence before disappearing just as quickly, with your town's wealth, and sometimes its people. The mainstream historical fact about these early raids is that they targeted primarily religious centers initially, places like Lindisfarne, Iona in Scotland, and Noirmoutier in France. This wasn't because the Vikings had a particular grudge against Christianity, though religious differences certainly didn't help, but because monasteries represented the perfect combination of wealth and vulnerability. They often contained precious metalwork, jeweled religious artifacts, stored food, and had minimal defenses. It was like finding an unlocked bank that also happened to have a fully stocked pantry and no security guards. As one Viking raider supposedly remarked when asked why they targeted churches, "Because that's where the money is." The first recorded instance of following the money as a criminal investigation technique would have to wait another 1,000 years. Here's a quirky tidbit. Vikings actually announced some of their raids with musical instruments. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts suggest they used horns and whistles, not just for signaling between ships, but to strike terror into the hearts of their victims. Imagine hearing an unearthly wailing sound coming across the water just before spotting those dreaded dragon prows. Psychological warfare at its most effective. Some accounts even describe Vikings deliberately combing their hair and beards before raids to appear more fearsome, leading one monk to complain about the unbearable vanity of these pagan attackers who were apparently part warrior, part influencer, ready for battle and a potential hair care sponsorship. The initial phase of Viking raiding followed a distinct seasonal pattern. You'd see raids begin in spring, peak in summer when sailing conditions were optimal, and taper off in autumn as raiders returned home with their plunder before winter storms made the seas too dangerous. These were hit-and-run operations. Arrive suddenly, grab everything valuable, and depart before local forces could organize resistance. Early targets were typically isolated, wealthy, and poorly defended communities within easy reach of the coast. As effective as these raids were, they were just the beginning. What started as seasonal raiding expeditions gradually evolved into something more permanent. By the 850s, Vikings were beginning to overwinter in the lands they raided, establishing bases from which they could operate year-round. In 851, for the first time, a Viking force remained in England through the winter, camping on the Isle of Thanet. This shift from raiding to semi-permanent occupation represented a new and more dangerous phase of Viking activity. Historians still argue about the true scale and brutality of these early Viking raids. Were they really as violent and traumatic as contemporary Christian chronicles suggest? Or have these accounts been exaggerated for political and religious purposes? After all, the people writing the histories were often the same monks whose monasteries had been targeted, and they had every reason to portray the raiders in the worst possible light. Some modern scholars suggest that while the raids were certainly disruptive and sometimes violent, the contemporary accounts of widespread slaughter might be somewhat overblown. Medieval clickbait, if you will, designed to shock readers and emphasize the otherness of these pagan northerners. What's undeniable is the psychological impact these raids had on European society. The famous prayer from the fury of the Northmen, "Deliver us, O Lord," though possibly apocryphal, captures the fear that permeated coastal communities. You're living in a world where danger could appear on the horizon without warning, where even the holiest places offered no sanctuary, where the sea itself, once a barrier, had become a highway for terror. The initial Viking raids reshaped European military strategy, forcing kingdoms to develop new defensive systems. In response to Viking mobility, Alfred the Great of Wessex would later create a network of fortified towns called bourgs throughout his kingdom, while the Franks began building bridges across rivers specifically designed to prevent Viking ships from sailing upstream. You're witnessing the beginning of a security arms race that would transform the European landscape, leaving behind fortifications that still stand today. A 1,000-year-old response to the threat that came from the north in dragon-headed ships. As the 9th century progresses, you witness Viking ambitions expanding beyond mere raiding. The Northern Atlantic beckons with promises of new lands, and nowhere captures this spirit of exploration and settlement better than Iceland. After decades of coastal raids, some Norse seafarers begin looking for something more permanent, places where they can establish homesteads, raise families, and build communities away from the increasingly centralized power of Scandinavian kings. Iceland had actually been discovered by Irish monks seeking solitude for their devotions sometime in the 8th century. These holy men, called the Papar by later Norse settlers, apparently decided that even harsh isolation was preferable to Viking company. When Norse explorers began arriving in earnest around 870 CE, these monks promptly departed, presumably muttering prayers for the souls of the newcomers while hastily packing their illuminated manuscripts. Talk about exclusive neighbors. The monks literally left the island rather than deal with Viking Homeowners Association regulations. Your journey to Iceland would begin in western Norway, perhaps from the area around modern-day Bergen. The voyage covers about 600 nautical miles of open ocean, a journey of 7 to 10 days in favorable conditions, but potentially weeks if storms or contrary winds intervene. You're crossing one of the most dangerous stretches of water in the world, with no modern navigation equipment, no weather forecasts, and no rescue services. The North Atlantic in a longship is not for the faint of heart or weak of stomach. According to the Landnámabók, the Book of Settlements, the first permanent Norse settler was Ingólfur Arnarsson, who arrived around 874 CE with his family and dependents. You can almost feel the mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration as Ingólfur's ship finally approaches the southern coast of Iceland after days at sea. The landscape that greets you is both beautiful and forbidding. Black volcanic beaches, towering cliffs, steaming geothermal vents, and in the distance, the ominous shapes of glaciers and volcanoes. It's like landing on an alien planet designed by a committee of fire and ice enthusiasts. Ingolfur brings with him a fascinating tradition that reveals much about Viking spiritual beliefs. As his ship nears land, he tosses his high seat pillars, carved wooden posts from his chieftain's chair in Norway, overboard, vowing to establish his homestead wherever these sacred items wash ashore. After a 3-year search along the coast, he finally finds them in a steam-filled bay he names Reykjavik, or Smoky Bay, which would eventually become Iceland's capital. It's perhaps the earliest recorded instance of letting home decor determine your real estate choices, though hopefully not a practice modern homebuyers will revive. The settlement of Iceland wasn't a single organized expedition, but rather a piecemeal process that unfolded over about 60 years, a period known as the landnam or land-taking. You're witnessing one of history's most remarkable voluntary migrations, as some 25,000 people, primarily from Norway, but also from Norse settlements in the British Isles, relocate to this remote island. What drives this massive movement of people? Part of the answer lies in events back in Scandinavia. In Norway, King Harald Fairhair is consolidating power, defeating regional chieftains, and imposing taxes and royal authority where independent local rule had prevailed. Many proud Norse chieftains and their followers prefer exile to submission, making Iceland, a land with no indigenous human population and thus no existing power structures, an attractive alternative despite its harsh environment. There's also evidence that many settlers came from already established Norse colonies in Scotland, Ireland, and the Hebrides, bringing with them cultural influences and even genetic heritage from these regions. The mainstream historical fact about Icelandic settlement that's well established is that the settlers brought with them a complete Norse society, not just warriors and farmers, but craftspeople, poets, priests, and lawmakers. This wasn't a military outpost, but a deliberate recreation of Norse culture on virgin soil. In 930 CE, just 60 years after the first permanent settlements, the Icelanders established the Althing, an assembly of chieftains that is considered the world's oldest parliamentary institution. You're watching the birth of a uniquely Norse experiment in governance, a commonwealth without a king, where free farmers and chieftains gather annually to settle disputes, establish laws, and maintain social bonds. Here's a quirky tidbit that rarely makes it into the history books. Icelandic settlers had to solve some truly bizarre environmental problems. The black sand beaches of Iceland look stunning, but prove nearly useless for traditional boat landing techniques. Norse ships typically beach directly on shore, but Iceland's volcanic sand could swallow longships up to their gunwales. Settlers had to build elaborate wooden boathouses and stone jetties just to keep their precious vessels from being consumed by the hungry shores of their new home. These boathouses became some of the most important structures in early Icelandic settlements, often more elaborate than the living quarters. When your only connection to the wider world is your ship, you treat it better than yourself. Life in this new settlement presents unprecedented challenges. Iceland has very few trees suitable for building or shipbuilding, forcing settlers to either conserve the limited woodlands they find or import timber at great expense. The growing season is short, and the volcanic soil, while fertile in some areas, is thin and easily eroded. Winters are long, dark, and bitterly cold. Yet somehow, these Norse pioneers adapt and persevere, developing a distinctive culture that would preserve aspects of ancient Norse traditions long after they had faded in Scandinavia itself. Historians still argue about the ecological impact of the Icelandic settlement. When humans arrived, approximately 25 to 40% of Iceland was covered in birch woodland. Within a century of settlement, much of this had been cleared for farming, fuel, and construction. This rapid deforestation, combined with the grazing of introduced livestock, particularly sheep, triggered soil erosion on a massive scale. Some scholars view this as an early environmental catastrophe caused by applying inappropriate continental farming techniques to a fragile island ecosystem. Others suggest that settlers quickly recognized the problem and developed sustainable practices, pointing to conservation laws in early Icelandic legal codes. The debate essentially centers on whether the Vikings were environmental vandals or adaptive innovators, or perhaps something in between. As the settlement period draws to a close around 930 CE, you find yourself in a society that is recognizably Norse, but with distinctive Icelandic characteristics. The isolation of the island, the harsh environment, and the independent spirit of the settlers have already begun to forge a unique identity. The stage is set for Iceland to become something remarkable, the preserver of Norse literary and historical traditions through the magnificent sagas that would be written down centuries later, providing our most detailed window into the Viking world.
The settlement of Iceland proves to be just the beginning of Viking expansion into the North Atlantic. As the Icelandic Commonwealth develops its unique society, some individuals find themselves at odds with this new order. Among them is a red-bearded Norwegian named Erik Thorvaldsson, better known to history as Erik the Red, not because of his communist leanings, several centuries too early for that, but due to his fiery hair and possibly fierier temper. You're in Iceland around 982 CE, witnessing one of the Commonwealth's legal assemblies. Erik has been declared an outlaw, again. His crime? Murder, again. This isn't his first exile. His father was banished from Norway for similar reasons, and Erik himself has already been temporarily outlawed once before for his involvement in some neighborhood killings. Viking conflict resolution often involved sharp objects rather than mediators, and Erik seems particularly enthusiastic about this approach to problem-solving. Faced with a 3-year banishment, Erik decides to investigate rumors of land glimpsed to the west by sailors blown off course. Instead of serving his sentence quietly, he's essentially saying, "Fine, I'll start my own country." It's the ultimate rage quit from Icelandic society. You join Erik's expedition as his small fleet of ships pushes westward into unknown waters. After a difficult journey of about 500 miles, a new land appears on the horizon, an immense island with a forbidding coastline dominated by towering glaciers and jagged mountains. As you sail southward along the coast, however, the landscape gradually transforms. The southwestern coast reveals sheltered fjords where the glaciers retreat inland, leaving green valleys that receive enough summer warmth to support grass and scattered shrubs. Here, Erik realizes, Norse farmers could potentially establish settlements similar to those in Iceland. After exploring for 3 years during his exile, Erik returns to Iceland with tales of this green land he has discovered. And here's where one of history's greatest real estate marketing campaigns begins. Despite the fact that over 80% of this massive island is covered in ice, Erik names it Greenland. According to the saga accounts, he does this deliberately because he said people would be attracted to go there if it had a favorable name. You're witnessing perhaps the first documented case of misleading advertising in real estate, like calling a modern studio apartment cozy or intimate, when what you really mean is barely larger than your bathroom. Erik's marketing proves effective. In 985 CE, he leads a flotilla of 25 ships containing approximately 500 colonists, along with their livestock, tools, and possessions, back to Greenland. The journey proves treacherous. Only 14 ships reach their destination, with the others either turning back or being lost at sea. Still, this forms the nucleus of what will become a permanent Norse presence in Greenland, lasting nearly 500 years. The mainstream historical fact about Greenland settlement is that the Norse established 2 main settlement areas. The larger eastern settlement in what is now southern Greenland, despite its name, it was actually on the southwestern coast, and the smaller western settlement about 300 miles further north along the same coast. At their peak, these colonies supported a population of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people living on approximately 280 farms. These weren't cities or even villages in the conventional sense, but rather scattered farmsteads, each housing an extended family and their dependents, much like the settlement pattern in Iceland. You find yourself at Erik's own farm at Brattle in the eastern settlement, where he establishes himself as the foremost chieftain of this new colony. The main dwelling is impressive by Norse standards, a long hall built of turf and stone with wooden supports, its interior smoky from the central hearth that provides both heat and light. Surrounding the main building are various outbuildings for livestock, storage, and specialized activities like blacksmithing or dairy processing. The colonists quickly establish a familiar Norse lifestyle, raising cattle, sheep, and goats in the green valleys during the short summer, then housing them indoors during the long, harsh winter. They hunt seals, walrus, and even polar bears to supplement their diet and to obtain valuable trade goods. Walrus ivory in particular becomes Greenland's most important export, necessary for maintaining connections with Europe. Here's a quirky tidbit about Greenland's Vikings. They developed an unusual dependency on drift ice. With few trees available for fuel or construction, Greenlanders relied heavily on driftwood carried from Siberia and North America by ocean currents. Beachcombing became a critical economic activity, with driftwood rights legally protected in surviving Greenlandic legal documents. Imagine your survival depending on what washes up on beach. It's like living exclusively off the contents of those storage units on reality TV shows, except what washes up is mostly wood rather than forgotten exercise equipment and mysterious locked trunks. Life in Greenland proves even more challenging than in Iceland. The growing season is shorter, the winters longer and darker, and isolation more profound. Despite these challenges, the colonies persist and even thrive for generations. Around 1000 CE, Christianity arrives. Erik's own son, Leif Erikson, introduces the new faith after a visit to Norway, and eventually a small cathedral is built at Gerar, complete with a bishop appointed from Europe. You're witnessing a remarkably resilient community maintaining European cultural and religious traditions at the very edge of the habitable world. Historians still argue about what ultimately happened to Greenland's Norse settlers. The colonies survived for nearly 5 centuries, but by 1500, they had mysteriously vanished. Climate change during the Little Ice Age, economic isolation as European trade patterns shifted, conflicts with Inuit peoples moving into the region, soil depletion, cultural inflexibility, or some combination of these factors have all been proposed as explanations. The Western settlement disappears from records around 1350, while the Eastern settlement persists perhaps as late as the early 1400s. The last documented event is a wedding at Valsey Church in 1408. After that, silence descends over the Norse Greenland colonies, leaving archaeologists to piece together their final chapter from the ruins they left behind. The story of Viking exploration doesn't end with Greenland. While Erik the Red was busy establishing his misleadingly named real estate development, his son Leif would push even further into the unknown. You're about to witness one of history's most remarkable journeys, the European discovery of North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus would claim the achievement for himself. Columbus at least had the advantage of knowing there was something out there. Leif was basically sailing off the edge of the medieval map with nothing but rumors and possibly a hangover to guide him. Around the year 1000 CE, you find yourself at Brattle, Erik the Red's estate in Greenland. There's excitement in the air as Leif Erikson prepares for a voyage westward. According to the later written Vinland sagas, Leif had heard tales from a merchant named Bjarni Herjolfsson who claimed to have sighted unknown lands further west after being blown off course while sailing to Greenland. Being the son of Erik the Red, Leif naturally thinks, if Dad could find a new land and name it something misleading, so can I. You join Leif's crew as his ship pushes westward into uncharted waters. After several days of sailing, land appears on the horizon, a barren place of flat stones that Leif names Helgeland or Flatstone Land, likely modern Baffin Island. Continuing southward, you next encounter a forested coastline that Leif calls Markland or Woodland, probably Labrador. The expedition presses onward, finally reaching a place where wild grapes or berries grow, which Leif names Vinland or Wineland. Here, in what is almost certainly Newfoundland, Leif establishes a small settlement consisting of several large houses. You help construct these buildings, cutting timber from the abundant forests and creating comfortable dwellings much larger than the cramped quarters on the ship. The location is strategically chosen, a meadow beside a small river that teems with salmon, with forests nearby for timber and game. After the marginal environments of Iceland and Greenland, this new land seems like paradise, with its relatively mild climate and abundant natural resources. The mainstream historical fact about Vinland that's now firmly established is the archaeological site at LanceEux Meadows on the northern tip of Newfoundland. Discovered in 1960 by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife and Stein Ingstad, this site provides conclusive evidence of Norse presence in North America around 1000 CE. You can see the foundations of 8 buildings constructed in the distinctive Norse style, 3 large halls and 5 smaller structures that may have been workshops or housing for single men. Archaeological analysis has determined these weren't permanent settlements but rather a wintering camp and potential launching point for further exploration, a Viking equivalent of a base camp. The artifacts recovered from Lance Aux Meadows tell a fascinating story. A small bronze pin used for fastening cloaks is unmistakably Norse in design. Iron slag and a stone anvil indicate metalworking took place here, perhaps repairing ships or tools. A spindle whorl suggests women were present, as textile production was typically women's work in Norse society. Most tellingly, butternuts and butternut wood were found at the site, neither of which grow naturally in Newfoundland, indicating the Norse explored further south, at least to New Brunswick or possibly New England, where these trees are native. Life in Vinland isn't all salmon fishing and grape gathering, however. The sagas record encounters with indigenous peoples whom the Norse called Skraelings, likely ancestors of either the Beothuk or Mi'kmaq peoples, or possibly Dorset culture Inuit. Initially, these encounters involve trading, the Norse exchanging red cloth for furs, but misunderstandings and probably Norse arrogance eventually lead to violent conflict. You witness one such skirmish where the technological advantage of Norse weapons is nearly overcome by the sheer numbers of indigenous warriors. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals much about Norse cultural assumptions. According to the saga of the Greenlanders, during one battle with the Skraelings, a pregnant Norse woman named Freydis Eriksdottir, Eric the Red's daughter, frightens away the attackers by slapping her bare breast with a sword while shouting defiance. The sagas present this as evidence of her exceptional courage or madness. But from a modern perspective, it also suggests something about how utterly bewildering Norse people must have appeared to Native Americans, hairy, metal-clad strangers arriving in dragon ships, whose women performed bizarre and terrifying actions when threatened. First contact is rarely a smooth cultural exchange, but this particular meeting of worlds was especially fraught with misunderstanding. Unlike the settlements in Iceland and Greenland, the Vinland experiment proves short-lived. After several attempted settlements over a period of perhaps a decade, the Norse ultimately abandoned their North American outpost. The sagas suggest this is primarily due to constant conflict with indigenous peoples and the great distance from Greenland, making supply and reinforcement difficult. You can imagine the disappointment as the Norse reluctantly load their ships and depart from this land of plenty, returning to the more marginal environments of Greenland and Iceland. A decision that would delay European colonization of North America by nearly 500 years. Historians still argue about the exact location and extent of Vinland. While Lance Aux Meadows conclusively proves Norse presence in Newfoundland, debate continues about whether this represents Vinland itself or merely a gateway to Vinland proper, which might have been further south. The description of wild grapes has led some scholars to suggest Vinland must have been as far south as New England, where wild grapes naturally grow. Others note that Vin, in Old Norse, could refer to berries as well as grapes, potentially placing Vinland in Newfoundland itself. The discovery of butternut remains at Lance Aux Meadows indicates exploration at least as far as New Brunswick, but the full extent of Norse exploration along the North American coast remains uncertain. What's certain is that you're witnessing one of history's great might-have-beens. Had the Norse maintained their presence in North America, the entire course of world history might have been altered. Instead, the knowledge of these western lands gradually faded into legend, preserved in the Icelandic sagas but largely forgotten by the wider European world. When Columbus made his famous voyage in 1492, he had no idea that Norse explorers had preceded him by nearly 5 centuries. The saga of Vinland represents both the pinnacle of Viking exploration and its limits. These remarkable seafarers had pushed the boundaries of the known world further than any Europeans before them, reaching across the Atlantic to a new continent. Yet their discovery, remarkable as it was, proved transient, a footnote in history rather than the beginning of a new chapter of European expansion. That would have to wait for another era, with different ships, different technologies, and different motivations driving humans to cross the Great Ocean. While some Vikings were pushing westward across the Atlantic, establishing settlements in distant lands, others were looking eastward, developing complex trading networks that would transform northern Europe. Not all Vikings were bloodthirsty raiders, after all. Some were bloodthirsty entrepreneurs, which is basically the same thing except with better accounting practices. You're standing on the shores of the Baltic Sea around the year 850 CE, watching heavily laden merchant ships move between bustling ports. The Baltic, that nearly landlocked sea surrounded by modern-day Scandinavia, Finland, Russia, and northern Germany and Poland, has become a Viking highway of commerce. Unlike the treacherous North Atlantic voyages to Iceland and beyond, the relatively calm and protected waters of the Baltic offer ideal conditions for regular trade. It's essentially the Viking version of Amazon Prime, reliable delivery without the hazards of being swallowed by sea monsters or disappearing into Atlantic storms. The geography of the Baltic region, with its countless islands, protected bays, and navigable rivers reaching deep into the European and Russian interior, creates perfect conditions for maritime trade. You watch as Norse merchants load their vessels with amber, furs, honey, wax, and slaves from the eastern shores, preparing to exchange these goods for Frankish wines, Rhineland glass, English wool, and Arabic silver at the growing trade centers around the Baltic Rim. At the heart of this Baltic trade network stands Hedeby, or Heathebu, located near modern Schleswig in northern Germany. As you approach this remarkable settlement, the bustle of activity becomes apparent even before you reach the harbor. Hedeby represents something new in northern Europe, a true trading town, or WIC, rather than merely a chieftain's hall or religious center. Protected by a massive semicircular rampart, the town houses craftspeople, merchants, sailors, and workers from across the known world. Walking through Hedeby's muddy streets, you're struck by the diversity of languages, goods, and people. A Syrian glass merchant haggles with a Frisian cloth trader while nearby. A craftsman from Rus works silver into intricate jewelry inspired by Asian designs. The air is thick with the smells of tanning leather, smoking fish, and bodies that haven't seen soap in rather too long. Medieval trade centers weren't big on public hygiene. Think of it as an open-air shopping mall where the ambient scent is less Cinnabon and more unwashed mariner with notes of pickled herring. Similar trading centers develop around the Baltic Rim, Birka in Sweden, Koppang in Norway, Truso in what is now Poland, and Staraya Ladiga in Russia. These aren't yet true cities in the Mediterranean sense, but they represent a new kind of settlement in the north, focused on commerce rather than agriculture or fishing. You're witnessing the birth of urban life in a region previously dominated by scattered rural settlements. The mainstream historical fact about Baltic trade that archaeology has firmly established is the remarkable reach of this network. Excavations at sites like Birka and Hedeby have uncovered artifacts from as far away as Byzantium, the Abbasid Caliphate, and even Tang Dynasty China. A single Viking merchant's grave might contain Byzantine silk, Arabic silver coins, Frankish weapons, and Baltic amber, tangible evidence of trade connections spanning thousands of miles. And you thought getting packages delivered from another state was impressive. The Vikings didn't just trade goods, they traded ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Their network served as Northern Europe's first information superhighway, spreading everything from architectural styles to religious concepts. Through their eastern trade routes, especially along the rivers of Russia, Vikings connected Northern Europe to the sophisticated civilizations of Byzantium and the Islamic world, facilitating a cultural exchange that would help pull Europe out of the so-called Dark Ages. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals much about Viking commercial savvy. They pioneered what might be called the first European commodities market. Archaeological evidence from Birka shows standardized weights used to measure silver, suggesting that raw silver, often in the form of hack silver, cut pieces, or Arab dirhams, functioned as currency in weight-based transactions. Vikings would carry small folding scales with them for on-the-spot verification of payment, essentially creating a primitive but effective banking system in places where no minted currency existed. They were medieval day traders, complete with portable financial instruments and a keen eye for arbitrage opportunities between different regional markets. You notice another fascinating aspect of this trade as you watch transactions taking place: the development of a simplified trading language. With merchants from dozens of language groups meeting regularly, a pidgin develops that combines Norse with Slavic, Finnic, and Germanic elements, the Baltic Basin's own commercial lingua franca. It's like the medieval equivalent of airport English, enough to haggle over prices and avoid accidentally buying a barrel of fermented fish when what you really wanted was iron ore. The success of the Baltic trade network relies heavily on a peculiar political arrangement. Despite their reputation for violence, Vikings establish remarkably stable trading relationships through a system of mutual protection agreements and standardized customs practices at key ports. Chieftains and early kings recognize that reliable trade brings wealth more consistently than raiding, and begin providing protection for merchants, for a fee, of course. You're watching the early development of regulated international commerce, complete with the Viking equivalent of customs officers and harbor police. Historians still argue about the degree to which the Baltic trade network represented a consciously developed system versus an organic evolution of opportunistic exchange. Some scholars view it as evidence of sophisticated economic planning by Scandinavian elites, pointing to the standardization of weights and measures found across the region. Others see it as a more ad hoc development driven by individual merchants responding to market opportunities without central direction. The debate essentially centers on whether we should view Viking trade as an early form of organized commercial policy or as a more freewheeling entrepreneurial phenomenon, medieval state capitalism versus Nordic free enterprise. What's clear as you travel these trade routes is that commerce is reshaping the North in profound ways. Wealth flowing in from trade allows chieftains to consolidate power, eventually enabling the formation of the kingdoms that would become Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Trading centers grow into towns and eventually cities, creating new social classes of urban dwellers distinct from the traditional farmer-warrior classes of earlier Norse society. Even religious change follows these routes, with Christianity gradually spreading along the same networks that carry silver and silk. The Baltic trade network would continue to develop and expand, eventually evolving into the powerful Hanseatic League of the later Middle Ages. While the specifically Viking phase of this commerce would fade as the Norse were gradually absorbed into the broader European cultural sphere, the foundations they laid, the routes, the ports, the commercial practices, would shape Northern European economics for centuries to come. While Viking merchants were busy establishing trade networks across the Baltic, another remarkable chapter in Norse history was unfolding far to the southeast. You're now standing in Constantinople, modern Istanbul, around the year 988 CE, witnessing the arrival of a most unusual diplomatic gift. Byzantine Emperor Basil II has requested military assistance from Prince Vladimir of Kiev, and in response, Vladimir has sent 6,000 Norse warriors. These aren't just any fighters, they're the cream of the Scandinavian warrior class, men who've earned their reputation in battles across Europe and now seek fame and fortune in service to the most powerful empire in the Christian world. This moment marks the official formation of the Varangian Guard, the elite personal bodyguard of Byzantine emperors for the next 300 years. The word Varangian comes from Old Norse Varingjar, originally meaning men who have sworn allegiance to each other. In Constantinople, it takes on a new meaning, the most feared and respected mercenary force in the medieval world. As you follow these warriors through the gleaming streets of Constantinople, their reaction to the city tells its own story. These men who have seen the wooden halls of Scandinavia and the muddy trading posts of the Baltic are now confronted with a metropolis of nearly 500,000 people, filled with marble palaces, monumental churches, and technological marvels like mechanical golden lions that roar and automated thrones that rise into the air during imperial audiences. One Norse warrior's written reaction survives: "I saw strange automata and other wonders beyond counting." It's basically the medieval equivalent of taking someone from a small town to Las Vegas, except instead of Elvis impersonators, they have mechanical birds that sing in the emperor's garden. The Byzantine emperors have good reason to want Norse warriors for their personal guard. As foreigners with no stake in Byzantine political intrigues, they can be trusted not to participate in the court conspiracies and coups that regularly plague the empire. Their loyalty is purchased with silver, not promised with political favors. You watch as these new recruits take their solemn oath to the emperor, swearing on their weapons in their native fashion rather than on Christian relics, a rare accommodation of pagan practices in this deeply Christian empire. The duties of the Varangian Guard are clearly defined: protect the emperor at all costs, maintain order in the capital, and serve as the empire's elite shock troops in battle. They're immediately recognizable by their distinctive equipment, long-handled Danish axes, their primary weapon, and by their size, as the Norse typically stand half a head taller than most Mediterranean peoples. The sight of these giant, axe-wielding northerners is designed to intimidate anyone contemplating violence against the imperial person. It's the medieval equivalent of the Secret Service, if the Secret Service carried battle axes and occasionally drank themselves into a berserker rage. The mainstream historical fact about the Varangian Guard that's well established is their exceptional loyalty to the Byzantine throne, not necessarily to individual emperors, but to the institution itself. When Emperor Michael V attempted to overthrow his co-ruler, the Empress Zoe, in 1042, the Varangians refused to support him, instead breaking into the palace to arrest him, literally chopping down his bedroom door with their axes while he hid in a monastery. Their battle cry, Torwald, became a dreaded sound in Constantinople, signaling that the emperor's elite northerners were on the move and someone's day was about to get considerably worse. You observe the Guard's special privileges in Constantinople with interest. They have their own quarters in the palace, receive pay far exceeding that of regular Byzantine troops, and after campaigns, enjoy the privilege of polylora, the right to help themselves to imperial treasures by grabbing as many valuables as they can carry in their arms at once. This leads to the curious sight of massive Norse warriors working out religiously, not to improve their fighting skills but to increase the circumference of their embrace for the next treasure grab opportunity. Never skip arm day when your retirement plan depends on how many golden candlesticks you can hug simultaneously. Here's a quirky tidbit that reveals much about cultural exchange. The Varangians established their own church in Constantinople, dedicated to Saint Olaf of Norway, where services were conducted in Old Norse. They also created a unique form of graffiti, runic inscriptions carved into the marble balustrade of Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom. One still visible carving simply states, Halfdan was here, proving that tourists have been defacing monuments with banal observations since at least the 11th century. Viking tourism, exactly like modern tourism, just with more battle axes and mead. Life for a Varangian guardsman centers on routine palace duties interspersed with bursts of intense military action. You follow them as they escort the emperor to church ceremonies, stand watch during diplomatic receptions, and patrol the palace complex. Off-duty, they frequent the taverns of Constantinople, spending their considerable pay on wine, women, and gambling, creating enough public disturbances that special regulations are eventually enacted specifically to control drunken Varangians. Some things about military personnel on leave never change, regardless of century. The most famous Varangian was undoubtedly Harald Hardrada, who served in the Guard between 1035 and 1043 before returning to Norway to become king. During his Byzantine service, Harald fought in campaigns from Sicily to the Holy Land, amassing such wealth that when he finally returned north, he needed several ships just to transport his treasure. His saga claims he performed a feat of strength by dragging a galley over the Thessaloniki Isthmus rather than sailing around the Peloponnese, probably an exaggeration, but indicative of the superhuman reputation Varangians cultivated. Historians still argue about the exact composition of the Varangian Guard over time. Initially dominated by Swedes and Norwegians who had traveled the eastern route through Russia, by the 11th century the Guard began to include Danes and Icelanders as well. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, English and Anglo-Saxon warriors fleeing Norman rule began joining in significant numbers, eventually becoming the predominant element. By the 12th century, Byzantine sources refer to the Guard as the axe-bearing barbarians from Thule, with Thule being their term for Britain. The debate centers on whether this change in composition also changed the character and reliability of the Guard, with some scholars suggesting the English Varangians lacked the fearsome reputation of their Norse predecessors. While the Varangian Guard was making its mark in Constantinople, An even more profound Norse influence was reshaping Eastern Europe. You're standing on the banks of the Dnieper River around 880 CE, watching a flotilla of ships making their way southward toward the Black Sea. These aren't just any vessels, they're distinctly Norse in design, though modified for river travel, with shallower drafts and removable masts. Their crews are a curious mixture, bearded Norse warriors and traders alongside Slavic oarsmen and guides. You're witnessing the culmination of a remarkable venture, Viking penetration deep into the heart of what will eventually become Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Norse presence in Eastern Europe follows a different pattern from their Western raids and settlements. Here, they come primarily as traders and rulers rather than raiders and farmers. The great rivers of Eastern Europe, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Dwina, the Neva, become Norse highways leading from the Baltic to the lucrative markets of Byzantium and the Islamic world. These waterways offer something the Western ventures lack: access to the fabulous wealth of the East without the terrors of open ocean sailing. It's like finding a backdoor entrance to the mall that lets you bypass both traffic and bad weather. The origins of this eastern expansion lie in the Swedish regions of Uppland and Södermanland, where restless warriors and merchants, known specifically as Russ, possibly derived from the Finnish word for Sweden, ruotsi, begin probing eastward across the Baltic in the early 9th century. You follow their journey, first establishing a foothold at Staraya Ladiga near Lake Ladiga around 750 CE, then gradually pushing deeper along the river systems. What makes this expansion possible is an ingenious solution to a geographical problem. The great Russian rivers flow either north to the Baltic or south to the Black Sea, but they don't directly connect. How do Vikings transport their ships between these separate watersheds? You watch as they demonstrate their solution at a portage point. The entire crew disembarks, unloads the cargo, places log rollers under the lightened ship, and physically drags it overland from one river system to the next. It's backbreaking work, but it creates a nearly continuous water route from the Baltic to Constantinople, the famous route from the Varangians to the Greeks, described in the Russian primary chronicle. According to this chronicle, written down in the 12th century but describing earlier events, the Slavic tribes initially pay tribute to these Norse incomers but eventually drive them out, only to fall into internal fighting. Unable to govern themselves, at least according to the chronicle, which might have its own biases, the Slavs invite the Rus back. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come to rule and reign over us. This invitation allegedly goes to a leader named Rurik, who establishes himself at Novgorod around 862 CE, beginning the dynasty that will rule Russia until the 16th century. Whether this story represents historical fact or founding mythology remains debated, but archaeological evidence confirms significant Norse presence in key early Russian settlements. You're witnessing the beginning of what historians call the Kievan Rus, a political entity that becomes the forerunner of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, initially established under Norse leadership but gradually adopting Slavic language and customs. The mainstream historical fact about this eastern expansion that archaeology has firmly established is the remarkable extent of Norse trade networks in the region. Thousands of Arabic silver coins, dirhams, have been found in Scandinavia, most arriving via the Russian river routes. In fact, so much silver flowed northward through these trade connections that it caused inflation in the Islamic world. Viking economic activity was literally disrupting the medieval global economy. They weren't just raiders but major players in international finance, like hedge fund managers with battle axes. As you travel with these Rus traders down the Dnieper toward Constantinople, you observe how they handle the river's most dangerous feature, a series of rapids that make navigation nearly impossible. Here's where you witness an extraordinary procedure described by the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII in his administrative manual De Administrando Imperio. The entire expedition stops above the rapids, the ships are unloaded, the cargo and sometimes the ships themselves are carried around the obstacle, while armed guards protect against attacks from the nomadic Pecheneg who lurk in the surrounding steppe, hoping to plunder these wealthy caravans. It's essentially a medieval version of a high-risk supply chain operation, complete with security concerns and logistical challenges that would make an Amazon fulfillment center manager break into a cold sweat. Here's a quirky tidbit about these Eastern Vikings. Their entrepreneurial spirit led to some truly creative problem-solving when it came to trading with Islamic merchants who were prohibited by religious law from handling coins bearing human images, which most European currencies did. The solution? Norse traders began minting their own imitation Arabic dirhams, complete with pseudo-Arabic inscriptions that were often just decorative squiggles, since most Vikings couldn't read Arabic anyway. These imitation coins have been found throughout the Viking trading world, representing perhaps the first case of designer knockoffs in European history. Is that a genuine Abbasid dirham? No, it's a Norse fake, but the silver content is good, and the inscription only says, "Thor was here," if you can actually read Arabic, which almost nobody can. The Norse rulers of the Rus quickly begin adopting Slavic customs, names, and language, a process of assimilation that happens much faster here than in the Western Viking settlements. By the third generation, these formerly Norse dynasties have transformed. Rurik's grandson, born with the Norse name Valdemar, is better known by his Slavic name, Vladimir. When he converts to Orthodox Christianity in 988 CE and orders the mass baptism of Kiev, the transformation is nearly complete. The ruling elite of the Rus have become culturally Slavic while retaining their Norse connections and trading networks. Historians still argue about the extent of Norse influence on the development of Russian political and social institutions. The traditional view, popular in the 18th and 19th centuries, held that the supposedly superior Germanic Varangians brought political organization to the disorganized Slavic tribes, a view that obviously carried problematic racial assumptions. Soviet historians, by contrast, minimized Norse influence almost entirely, emphasizing indigenous Slavic developments. Modern scholarship seeks a more balanced view, recognizing significant Norse contributions to early Russian state formation while acknowledging the primarily Slavic character of the population and culture that emerged. The debate essentially centers on whether we should view the Kievan Rus as Vikings who became Russian, or Russians who happened to have Viking rulers for a while. Beyond their remarkable ships, the Norse possessed an array of technologies and techniques that made their expansion possible. As you examine the equipment of a typical Viking warrior explorer, you begin to understand how these people from the northern edge of Europe could project power so far from their homeland. It wasn't just courage or ferocity that allowed them to dominate, it was technological innovation applied with practical ingenuity. The Viking sword represents the pinnacle of early medieval metallurgy. You lift one from its scabbard, surprised by its perfect balance. These weren't the crude, heavy weapons popular culture sometimes depicts. A typical Viking sword weighs less than 3 pounds, with a blade pattern welded from multiple types of iron, a flexible core surrounded by harder steel edges. This creates a weapon flexible enough not to snap in battle, yet hard enough to maintain a lethal cutting edge. Running your finger carefully along the fuller, the groove down the center of the blade, often mistakenly called a blood channel by enthusiastic tour guides, you feel how this engineering feature lightens the blade without sacrificing strength. It's the medieval equivalent of space-grade aluminum, providing structural integrity with reduced weight. These swords represent significant wealth, the cost equivalent of a car in today's terms, and often bear names and inscriptions. Some even have the mysterious maker's mark Ulfbert inlaid in the blade, a sort of medieval designer label that archaeologists have found on swords scattered across Europe. Metallurgical analysis reveals these particular blades contain crucible steel with carbon content not otherwise seen in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. These weren't just weapons, they were high-tech luxury items trading on brand recognition. Imagine a world where the hottest status symbol isn't the latest iPhone but having the newest Ulfbert sword. Oh, is that last year's model? Mine has the improved pommel design and 15% more decapitation capability. While the sword might be the prestige weapon, the Viking axe is more commonly carried. Affordable, versatile, and brutally effective. You heft one, noting how the weight distribution allows maximum force at the moment of impact. The broader blades of Viking combat axes are distinctly different from their woodcutting counterparts. These are designed for battlefield use, though in a pinch, they could certainly help you set up camp. Talk about multipurpose gear. The REI of the 10th century. Viking armor technology emphasizes mobility over complete protection. The iconic helmet, which never, ever featured horns outside modern opera productions, despite what your Halloween costume suggested, is a simple rounded design with eye and nose protection. Mail shirts, called burnie, provide excellent defense against cutting attacks while allowing the freedom of movement essential for shipboard operations. Complete suits of mail represent enormous wealth, containing up to 20,000 individually riveted iron rings and requiring months of skilled labor to produce. Most Viking raiders make do with thick padded clothing, perhaps reinforced with small metal plates or hardened leather. The focus is always on practical protection that doesn't impede movement or increase the risk of drowning if you happen to take an unexpected swim, a genuine occupational hazard in the Viking profession. The mainstream historical fact about Viking technology that archaeology has firmly established is their mastery of specialized tools for navigation. The sunstone, Solarstein, mentioned earlier is just one example. Vikings also used primitive but effective sunshadows boards, Salskuggafold, wooden discs with a central gnomon that functioned as a basic sundial, allowing navigators to determine approximate latitude by measuring the sun's shadow at noon. A Viking navigator's toolkit might also include a bearing dial, a wooden disc marked with the cardinal directions used with a sunshadow stick to determine direction. These tools, combined with deep observational knowledge of bird migrations, cloud patterns, ocean currents, and stellar navigation, enabled Norse explorers to find their way across open ocean with remarkable accuracy, most of the time, anyway. No technology is perfect, which explains why Vikings occasionally ended up in Newfoundland when they were aiming for Greenland. Even the most sophisticated medieval GPS sometimes recalculated the route without warning. You're particularly impressed by the practical innovations Vikings developed for survival in harsh environments. Their clothing technology, especially for North Atlantic voyages, demonstrates sophisticated understanding of insulation and waterproofing. Multiple layers of wool, which retains warmth even when wet, form the foundation. Outer garments might be treated with beeswax or animal fats for water resistance. Leather provides wind protection. Specialized mittens designed to allow quickly freeing the fingers for detailed work without removing the entire mitten show the thoughtful design behind Viking cold weather gear. It's like ancient Elbein, minus the return policy and the catalog cluttering your mailbox. Here's a quirky tidbit about Viking innovation. They developed specialized ice skates from polished animal bones, typically horse or cow leg bones, strapped to the bottom of their boots. These bone skates didn't allow for hockey-style stopping. They had no edges to dig into the ice, but they significantly increased winter mobility on frozen lakes and rivers, particularly in Sweden and Russia. Archaeological evidence shows these skates were used not just for recreation but for regular winter transportation. Imagine commuting to work on bones strapped to your feet. The original Bones Brigade, centuries before skateboarding made it cool. Viking military technology extends beyond weapons to sophisticated tactical systems. The famous shield wall formation requires standardized shield dimensions and extensive training to execute properly. You watch as warriors practice interlocking their shields to create a nearly impenetrable barrier, much like the Roman testudo formation but adapted for Norse fighting styles. The terrifying berserker warriors, possibly using mind-altering substances like bog myrtle or mushrooms to induce their frenzied state, serve as shock troops to break enemy formations. Whether through chemistry or psychology, these fighters achieve a state where they seem impervious to pain and fear, making them the medieval equivalent of an armor-piercing round against conventional defenses. Historians still argue about the level of formal organization in Viking military operations. Some scholars see evidence of sophisticated command structures and standardized units, particularly in the Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865 CE. Others view Viking forces as more opportunistic confederations of independent warbands united temporarily under charismatic leaders. The debate essentially centers on whether we should view Viking military operations as proto-state warfare or as large-scale raiding parties, whether they were more like a medieval army or a very enthusiastic flash mob with axes. Archaeological evidence of standardized weights and measures in Viking camps suggests more organization than the barbarian horde stereotype implies, but the exact nature of their command structure remains contested. As impressive as their military technology is, perhaps the most important Viking innovation is prosaic but powerful: the rotary quern for grinding grain. This simple machine dramatically increases the efficiency of flour production compared to earlier hand-grinding methods, allowing communities to process food faster and support larger populations. Not as glamorous as a pattern-welded sword, perhaps, but arguably more important for sustaining Viking expansion. After all, even the fiercest warrior needs bread to accompany all that plundered mead. To understand the Viking mind, you need to understand their gods. As you sit in a dimly lit longhouse, the fire crackling in the central hearth, an old skald, poet, begins reciting tales of Asgard and its inhabitants. These aren't just entertaining stories, they're the spiritual framework that shapes every aspect of Norse life, from governance to warfare to exploration. Viking mythology isn't relegated to temples or special occasions. It permeates every moment, every decision, every journey into unknown waters. The Norse pantheon is refreshingly dysfunctional, like a supernatural reality show where everyone has magical weapons and serious anger management issues. At the top sits Odin, the one-eyed all-father, god of wisdom, poetry, death, and magic. He sacrificed his eye for knowledge and hung himself from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days to gain the wisdom of the runes. Odin doesn't seek worshippers who pray quietly in temples. He wants warriors who die gloriously in battle, for only the battle-slain can join his Hall of Heroes, Valhalla, where they'll feast and fight until Ragnarok, the end of all things. Thor, the red-bearded thunder god with his hammer Mjolnir, represents a more straightforward divine force, protector of humanity, slayer of giants, and the common person's deity. While Odin appeals to chieftains and poets, Thor's cult attracts farmers, sailors, and everyday Vikings. His hammer amulets are everywhere, worn as protective talismans by men and women alike. Think of him as the blue-collar god with the best weapon and the worst temper, the divine equivalent of that friend who's absolutely the person you want beside you in a bar fight, but probably shouldn't be left unsupervised around fragile objects or diplomatic situations. Freyr and Freya, the divine siblings associated with fertility, wealth, and sexuality, ensure bountiful harvests and human reproduction. Njord governs the sea and maritime ventures. Tyr, the one-handed god of law and heroic glory, represents courage and sacrifice. Loki, the trickster figure neither fully god nor fully enemy, introduces chaos and innovation into the divine order. Together, these figures and dozens of lesser deities form a complex spiritual ecosystem that explains natural phenomena, social relationships, and cosmic purpose. What makes Norse mythology particularly relevant to exploration is its fatalistic yet bold worldview. You're sitting in that smoky longhouse, listening as the skald describes Ragnarok, the inevitable doom of the gods themselves. In the Norse understanding, even Odin cannot escape his fated death at Ragnarok when the wolf Fenrir will devour him. Thor will fall battling the Midgard serpent. The world itself will sink into the sea before being reborn. This cosmic fatalism paradoxically creates not despair but a culture of courage and bold action. If even the gods cannot escape their fate, why should humans fear taking risks? The concept of fate doesn't encourage passivity but rather a clear-eyed acceptance that certain events lie beyond control, while still leaving space for personal glory within fate's framework. It's basically cosmic stoicism with battle axes, acknowledging you can't control everything while determinately making your mark on what you can influence. The mainstream historical fact about Norse religion that archaeology has firmly established is its focus on practicality rather than abstract theology. Viking religious practice centers on direct transactions with the divine, sacrifices offered for specific outcomes like good harvests, safe voyages, or victory in battle. The famous account from Ahmad ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Norse ship burial on the Volga River around 921 CE, describes elaborate rituals including animal sacrifices, drinking, sexual activities, and ultimately human sacrifice. While Ibn Fadlan's perspective as an outside observer certainly colors his account, archaeological evidence confirms many aspects of Norse funeral practices, including ship burials containing weapons, tools, food, drink, and sometimes sacrificed animals to accompany the deceased into the afterlife. The Vikings weren't just sending off the dead, they were equipping them for their next journey, the prehistoric equivalent of packing your recently departed uncle an overnight bag, complete with his favorite battle axe and a six-pack for the road. For Vikings preparing to set sail for unknown lands, religious rituals provide crucial psychological support. You watch as a chieftain leading an expedition to Iceland performs blot, sacrifice, to Njord and Thor, seeking their favor for safe passage. The blood of a sacrificed horse is collected in a bowl and sprinkled over the ship, crew, and assembled onlookers using a ritual twig. The meat is then boiled in sacred cauldrons and consumed in a communal feast where participants renew their bonds with each other and with the gods. It's part spiritual ceremony, part barbecue, part team-building exercise, a divine tailgate party before the big game of ocean crossing. Here's a quirky tidbit about Viking spiritual practices. They engaged in a form of divination called udasita, literally sitting out, where a person would spend the night sitting on a burial mound, crossroads, or other liminal space to receive visions or communicate with the dead. This practice was considered particularly potent at certain times like the winter solstice or summer's end. Imagine a spiritual practice that basically amounts to supernatural camping, setting up at a graveyard with nothing but your cloak and some mead, hoping the universe sends you a helpful vision rather than just mosquito bites and creepy nighttime animal sounds. The Norse concept of the afterlife offers multiple destinations based not on moral behavior but on manner of death. Those who die in battle go to Odin's Valhalla or Freya's field Folkvanger. Those who drown belong to the sea goddess Ran. Those who die of illness or old age journey to Hel, not a place of punishment but simply an underworld ruled by the goddess of the same name. This complex afterlife geography creates strong incentives for seeking certain kinds of deaths while avoiding others. For warriors and explorers, dying with a weapon in hand, even if death seems certain, is preferable to succumbing passively to disease or age. It's perhaps history's most effective marketing campaign for workplace safety hazards. Dangerous mission across uncharted seas? Sign me up, beats dying in bed. Historians still argue about how seriously individual Vikings took these mythological beliefs. Were they literal beliefs, cultural metaphors, or something in between? The archaeological record shows people seemingly hedging their spiritual bets, burials containing both Thor's hammer amulets and Christian crosses, suggesting either religious transition periods or pragmatic spiritual insurance policies. I'm mainly worshipping Thor these days, but I've got this cross just in case the White Christ turns out to be the better long-term investment. The romanticized image of Viking exploration, fearless warriors standing proudly at the prow, dragon-headed ships slicing through waves toward destiny, conveniently glosses over the daily realities of life aboard these vessels. You're about to discover that the Viking seafaring experience was less majestic adventure and more medieval sardine can with occasional drowning hazards. Step aboard a typical ocean-going longship during the height of Viking expansion. The first thing that hits you is the smell, a pungent cocktail of unwashed bodies, wet wool, tar-treated wood, stale beer, fish, both fresh and fermented, and the ever-present tang of salt water. Personal space is a luxury that simply doesn't exist. Each crew member is allocated approximately 2 feet of width along the ship's side, enough to sit at an oar or lie down, but certainly not both simultaneously. Your seat is your sea chest, containing your personal belongings, extra clothing, and perhaps a few treasured possessions. This chest also serves as your bed when it's your turn to sleep. There's no standing up straight for most of the journey. When not rowing or helping with the sail, you're sitting, hunched, or lying down. Sleeping arrangements on these voyages define the term hot bunking centuries before submarine service would make it standard practice. With watches typically divided into 4-hour shifts, you share your sleeping spot with at least one other crew member. When you're on duty, they're sleeping in your space, and vice versa. Privacy consists of pulling your cloak over your head and pretending not to hear your shipmates' bodily functions happening mere inches away. It's like the worst college dorm experience imaginable, except it lasts for weeks or months, and your roommates all have axes. The practical challenges of long-distance Viking voyages begin with the most basic human needs. Fresh water is stored in barrels, but it quickly becomes stagnant and unpalatable. This is partly why beer is a shipboard staple. The alcohol content helps prevent harmful bacterial growth, making it safer than water that's been sitting in a wooden barrel for weeks. Each sailor might consume up to 2 liters of beer daily, not primarily for intoxication but for hydration and calories. You're not drinking to get drunk, you're drinking to survive, though the mild buzz probably helps make the cramped conditions more tolerable. Food preservation technologies define the Viking diet at sea. Without refrigeration, crews rely on techniques like drying, smoking, salting, fermenting, and pickling. Your daily meals consist of dried fish, particularly cod, hard bread or ship's biscuit, skyr, a yogurt-like dairy product, cheese, and occasionally dried fruit or nuts. On longer voyages, live animals might be brought along, chickens for eggs or even a couple of goats for milk, kept in small pens at the bow or stern. The highlight of the culinary day is the hot meal, prepared in a large cauldron over a small fire contained in a sandbox on deck, weather permitting, of course. During storms, it's back to gnawing on what Viking sailors called stone bread, ship's biscuits so hard that breaking a tooth is an occupational hazard. The mainstream historical fact about life aboard Viking ships that archaeological evidence confirms is the remarkable democratic structure of these voyages. While a designated leader, often the ship's owner or a chosen captain, makes final decisions, evidence suggests many matters were decided by consensus among the crew. Ship finds reveal common eating vessels rather than distinctive ones for leaders, and saga accounts describe regular councils where all free men could speak. This doesn't mean Viking ships were floating utopias of equality. Hierarchy still existed, but compared to later European naval traditions with their rigid command structures, Norse voyages operated on a flatter social organization. Think less absolute captain and more project manager with a battle axe who values input but reserves veto power. Personal hygiene aboard presents particular challenges. Contrary to the popular image of filthy barbarians, archaeological evidence suggests Vikings were actually quite concerned with cleanliness by medieval standards. Small combs, ear spoons, yes, literally spoons for cleaning ears, and other grooming implements are common finds in Viking graves and settlements. On ship, however, opportunities for washing are limited to rainfall or brief shore stops. The practical solution? Regular swimming when weather and circumstances permit. Norse people are generally strong swimmers, a necessary survival skill for seafarers, and use these opportunities to clean both body and clothing. Beards and hair are carefully maintained with combs made of bone or antler, and yes, Vikings did brush their teeth, using small twigs with frayed ends as primitive toothbrushes. Dental analysis of Viking remains shows where patterns consistent with some form of regular cleaning, though their results would hardly impress a modern dentist. Here's a quirky tidbit about shipboard life. Viking crews developed elaborate entertainment systems to maintain morale during long journeys. In addition to traditional storytelling and song, many played board games like Nafatiful, a chess-like strategy game, and dice games using ceramic or bone dice. Archaeological finds from shipwrecks and Viking settlements include numerous game pieces, suggesting these weren't just occasional diversions but essential components of Norse culture. One saga describes a dispute during a chess match that ended with one player using the board to bash his opponent's skull, proving that rage quitting has a much longer history than online gaming, though the consequences were considerably more permanent than just losing your Xbox privileges. The psychological challenges of these voyages may have been as demanding as the physical ones. You're essentially trapped in an open boat with the same 30 to 60 people for weeks or months, completely dependent on each other for survival while facing the constant uncertainties of weather, navigation, and potential hostile encounters. Saga accounts describe the special terror of fog, being surrounded by blankness, unable to navigate, vulnerable to running aground or being attacked without warning. To combat this psychological strain, crews developed rituals and superstitions, never saying certain words that might bring bad luck, performing specific actions when certain birds appeared, carefully observing omens in natural phenomena. These weren't just random superstitions but psychological coping mechanisms that gave sailors a sense of control in an inherently uncontrollable environment. Historians still argue about the level of conflict and violence within Viking crews during long voyages. Some scholars, pointing to the tightly controlled violence in Norse society and the mutual dependency of crew members, suggest that shipboard disputes were rare and regulated through established procedures. Others, citing saga accounts of blood feuds erupting at sea, argue that the stress of voyaging could trigger explosive violence. The debate essentially centers on whether Viking ships operated more like well-disciplined military units or powder kegs of potential conflict held in check only by the greater dangers of the sea, whether the real danger came from outside the ship or within it. The popular image of Viking exploration as an exclusively male endeavor couldn't be further from the truth. As the longships ventured to new lands, they carried not just warriors and traders but entire families, including women who would play crucial roles in establishing and maintaining Norse settlements abroad. You've been imagining bearded men with axes as the sole protagonists of this story, but it's time to expand your view of who actually built the Viking world. Archaeological evidence from graves and settlements across the Viking diaspora reveals a fundamental truth. Women were essential participants in the Norse expansion. The study of skeletal remains from early settlements in Iceland, Greenland, and the British Isles shows that women made up a significant portion of the migrating population, in some cases approaching a 50-50 gender ratio. This wasn't just warrior men setting up outposts. These were community migrations, with women traveling alongside men to build new lives in distant lands. The journey itself presented particular challenges for women. That cramped longship you've been imagining? Now picture making that journey while pregnant, or caring for small children amid the waves and spray. Saga accounts mention women giving birth during ocean crossings, with makeshift privacy created by hanging cloaks around a small section of the ship. The physical resilience required for such journeys challenges our modern assumptions about comfort and necessity. These women weren't just passengers but active participants in the voyaging process, preparing food, maintaining clothing and equipment, and in emergencies, potentially taking a turn at the oars. Once established in new settlements, Norse women's responsibilities expanded far beyond what medieval stereotypes might suggest. While men might be away for months conducting trade or raiding, women effectively became the managers of the Norse diaspora, running farms, overseeing livestock, preserving food, producing textiles, and maintaining the economic foundation that made continued expansion possible. In Iceland particularly, where men were frequently absent on return voyages to Norway or trading expeditions elsewhere, women often served as de facto heads of household for extended periods. The legal position of women in Viking society granted them rights remarkable for medieval Europe. You're living in a world where Norse women can own property, initiate divorce, reclaim their dowries, and inherit wealth, legal rights that women in much of Europe wouldn't gain for nearly 1,000 years. In Iceland's early law code, the Gragas, women could even serve as witnesses in legal proceedings and bring lawsuits under certain circumstances. This doesn't mean Viking society was some progressive gender utopia. Women couldn't participate directly in the thing, assembly, and were still subject to male guardianship, but compared to contemporary Anglo-Saxon or Frankish societies, Norse women enjoyed substantially more autonomy. The mainstream historical fact about women in Viking expansion that archaeology has conclusively demonstrated is their crucial role in textile production. Spindle whorls, loom weights, needles, and fabric fragments are among the most common findings at Norse settlements worldwide. This wasn't just a domestic activity but a cornerstone of the Viking economy. The production of woolen sailcloth for ships, vadmel, a dense woolen cloth used as both clothing and currency, and specialized textiles for trade represented significant economic contributions. The sails that powered Viking ships across the Atlantic were almost certainly woven by women, making them literal architects of exploration. Without their expertise in producing the specialized sailcloth that could withstand North Atlantic gales, long-distance voyaging would have been impossible. Talk about being essential workers. While men might wield the oars, women created the sails that actually got those dragon ships to America. The sagas preserve accounts of remarkable women who directly participated in exploration and settlement. Beauty the Deep-Minded, or Chpga, a widow who led her own expedition from Scotland to Iceland in the 9th century, exemplifies female leadership in the settlement process. After her son's death in Scotland, she commissioned a ship in secret, gathered her family and dependents, and sailed first to the Orkneys and Faroes before finally establishing a significant settlement in western Iceland. She allocated land to her followers, freed her slaves, providing them with startup resources, and became a regional powerhouse, all without remarrying or placing herself under male authority. When she died, she was buried in a ship on the shore, a burial normally reserved for male chieftains. Udi wasn't an exception that proved the rule. She represented a recognized, if uncommon, model of female authority in the Norse world. Here's a quirky tidbit about women in Viking exploration. Archaeological evidence from a 10th century grave in Birka, Sweden, once assumed to be a powerful male warrior due to its weapons and war gear, was revealed through DNA analysis in 2017 to belong to a woman. The burial included a sword, axe, spear, battle knife, shields, and 2 sacrificed horses, the complete panoply of a high-status warrior. This discovery sparked intense debate about women's potential combat roles in Viking society. While this doesn't prove that shield maidens were common, it does suggest our modern assumptions about rigid gender roles in the past may be oversimplified. Some women apparently packed more than just extra underwear and snacks for those long voyages. They brought their complete battle kit, ready to defend new settlements if necessary. It's like discovering your grandmother's luggage contains not just homemade cookies but also a tactical weapon system, just in case. Women's religious roles also shaped the settlement experience. In pre-Christian Norse society, women often served as volar, singular vulva, seers or shamanic practitioners who could communicate with spirits and foretell the future. The saga of Eric the Red describes a vulva named Thorbjorg participating in elaborate rituals to predict when a famine would end in the Greenland settlement, wearing a distinctive costume including a staff, special stones, and animal skins while entering a trance state to commune with spirits. These spiritual specialists provided psychological reassurance during the stressful process of establishing communities in harsh new environments. Think of them as combination therapists, meteorologists, and strategic planning consultants, except their forecasting methodology involved magic songs and spirit journeys rather than spreadsheets and weather satellites. Historians still argue about the degree to which the relatively strong position of women in Norse society translated to actual power in the expansion process. Some scholars emphasize the legal rights and economic contributions of women as evidence of their significant influence, while others point to the overwhelmingly male-dominated political structures that ultimately controlled major decisions. The debate essentially centers on whether we should view Viking women as exceptionally empowered for their era or still fundamentally constrained by patriarchal structures, whether they were partners in the process of expansion or simply better treated subordinates. Like many historical questions about marginalized groups, the answer likely varies widely based on individual circumstances, regional variations, and economic status. As the 11th century dawns, you sense a change in the atmosphere throughout the Norse world. The age of unbridled expansion is drawing to a close, like a long ship gradually approaching the shore after a lengthy voyage. Several powerful forces are converging to transform Viking society from within and without, bringing an end to the era of dragon-headed ships appearing on foreign horizons and striking terror into local populations. Don't worry, the Norse aren't going extinct. They're just trading in their battle axes for baptismal fonts and tax collection systems. The most visible transformation is religious. You're standing in the Great Hall of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway around 995 CE, watching as he presents his chieftains with a straightforward choice: accept Christian baptism or face immediate and unpleasant consequences. Olaf, having converted during his travels abroad, isn't interested in philosophical religious debates or gradual cultural shifts. His approach to Christianization can best be described as enthusiastically coercive: convert or get a practical demonstration of what Valhalla looks like firsthand. This forceful top-down conversion represents a stark change from the more gradual, syncretic religious shifts occurring over previous decades. Christianity had been making inroads among the Norse for over a century through trade contacts, missionary activity, and political alliances. But the final phase of conversion happens with remarkable speed and thoroughness. Within a single generation, officially at least, Scandinavia transforms from a pagan society to a Christian one. In Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, whose name now graces your wireless headphones, converts around 965 C. Sweden's conversion takes longer, with pagan practices continuing in some regions into the 12th century, but the trajectory is clear. The old gods are being replaced by the white Christ. This religious transformation fundamentally alters the ideological foundation of Viking expansion. The warrior ethos that drove much Norse activity, where dying in battle guaranteed entry to Valhalla, gives way to Christian conceptions of sin, salvation, and a very different afterlife where how you lived, not how you died, determined your eternal fate. Raiding monasteries becomes not just politically problematic but spiritually dangerous when those monasteries represent your own faith. It's hard to maintain your reputation as the terror of the Christian world when you're lining up for communion every Sunday and wearing a cross around your neck. Simultaneously, political changes reshape the Norse homeland. You witness the consolidation of power under strong monarchies in Denmark, Norway, and eventually Sweden, replacing the earlier patchwork of chieftainships and small kingdoms. These new, more centralized states exercise greater control over their populations, channeling the martial energies that once drove raiding into state-sponsored warfare and taxation systems. The freebooting Viking captain, answerable only to his crew and his own ambition, increasingly finds himself replaced by the royal official collecting taxes or the professional soldier serving in a king's army. It's like watching a startup company with a chaotic but innovative culture get acquired by a multinational corporation. Suddenly there are org charts, quarterly reviews, and significantly less drinking mead from the skulls of your enemies. External changes contribute equally to the Viking Age's decline. You observe how European kingdoms, after 2 centuries of Norse incursions, have finally developed effective countermeasures. Coastal warning systems, networks of fortified bridges preventing ship passage upriver, professional standing armies, and improved castle designs make raiding increasingly difficult and less profitable. The easy targets are gone, defensive networks are stronger, and the risk-reward calculation that once favored bold Norse captains now suggests they might want to consider a nice peaceful trading voyage instead, or perhaps a career in agriculture with significantly less chance of being shot full of arrows. The mainstream historical fact about the end of the Viking Age that scholars generally agree upon is that the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 CE represents a symbolic endpoint to the era of Viking expansion. Harold Godwin's son of England defeats and kills Harald Hardrada of Norway, who had invaded with a substantial fleet in an attempt to claim the English throne. Harald Hardrada, the last of the Vikings who had served in the Varangian Guard, fought across the Mediterranean, and amassed legendary wealth, dies in a failed attempt to conquer England. 3 weeks later, Harold himself falls at the Battle of Hastings against William of Normandy, ironically, a descendant of Vikings who had settled in France. This rapid sequence of events effectively closes the book on independent Norse military action in Western Europe. Here's a quirky tidbit about the twilight of the Viking Age. After Christianity became established in Scandinavia, many people continued practicing dual faith observances, maintaining aspects of traditional Norse religion alongside their new Christian identity. Archaeological evidence includes amulets with both Thor's hammer and Christian crosses combined in a single object, medieval spiritual hedging. One particularly amusing account describes a Norse sailor who would pray to Christ while at sea in good weather but switch to calling on Thor during storms, reasoning that the old thunder god had more experience with bad weather emergencies. It's essentially the spiritual equivalent of having both a primary care physician and that slightly questionable herbalist your aunt recommended. Why limit your options when your life might depend on getting help from somewhere? The integration of Norse settlers into local populations across Europe accelerates during this period. In the British Isles, Normandy, Russia, and elsewhere, descendants of Viking settlers increasingly identify with their new homelands rather than their Scandinavian origins. Distinctive Norse cultural practices, language, and identity gradually fade through intermarriage and cultural assimilation. You can see this process most clearly in Normandy, where the Northmen, Normans, who settled under Rollo in 911 CE have, by the early 11th century, adopted French language, customs, and identity so thoroughly that they're essentially unrecognizable as Scandinavians, though they retain the Norse enthusiasm for conquest, as England would discover in 1066. Historians still argue about whether the end of the Viking Age represents a decline in Norse culture or simply its transformation and integration into medieval European civilization. Some scholars emphasize the loss of distinctive Norse traditions, technologies, and independence as European standardization and Christian uniformity spread northward. Others point to the remarkable cultural achievements of post-Viking Scandinavia, the legal codes, literature, and art that preserve and develop Norse cultural elements within a Christian framework. The debate essentially centers on whether we should view the end of the Viking Age as cultural defeat or successful adaptation, whether the Norse were victims of history or canny players who exchanged their axes for crosses when the cost-benefit analysis suggested it was time for a rebrand. The Viking Age officially ended nearly 1,000 years ago, but the Norse explorers never really left our collective imagination. Their legacy endures not just in archaeology and history books, but in our popular culture, our language, our politics, and even our DNA. You're living in a world still profoundly shaped by those bearded mariners who once crossed impossible distances in open boats, guided by the stars and their indomitable will to discover what lay beyond the horizon. The archaeological footprint of Viking exploration continues to expand with new discoveries. You're witnessing an exciting era in Viking studies, as modern technology reveals previously hidden aspects of Norse activity. Ground-penetrating radar has identified massive ship burials in Norway that researchers are only beginning to excavate. Metal detectorists regularly uncover hoards of Viking silver across the British Isles and Northern Europe. DNA analysis is rewriting our understanding of the genetic impact of Norse settlement, revealing that Viking explorers were far more diverse in their origins and appearance than previously thought, with evidence of Sami, Baltic, and even North African genetic markers in the Viking diaspora. These modern-day revelations would probably amuse those pragmatic Norse explorers. Imagine explaining to Eric the Red that 1,000 years later, scientists would be analyzing his genetic haplogroup and arguing about his potential lactose intolerance on academic Twitter. The mainstream historical fact about Viking legacy that scholars universally acknowledge is their profound impact on world geography through exploration and settlement. The modern nations of Iceland and Norway proudly claim their Viking heritage, but Norse influence shaped political boundaries and population patterns across northern Europe. The very name Russia derives from Russ, those Swedish Vikings who traveled the eastern river routes. Normandy, land of the Northmen, exists because of Viking settlement in northern France, which later led to the Norman conquest of England, fundamentally altering British history. Even North American history bears Viking fingerprints. The brief Norse presence in Newfoundland represents the first documented European contact with the Americas, predating Columbus by nearly 500 years. The map of our world would look dramatically different without those dragon-proud ships venturing into the unknown. In popular culture, Vikings have become ubiquitous, though often in forms their historical counterparts would find barely recognizable. You can't scroll through streaming services without encountering Norse warriors in television series like Vikings or The Last Kingdom. Video games from Assassin's Creed Valhalla to God of War reimagine Norse mythology for digital adventurers. Marvel's Thor brings a Hollywood-glossed version of the thunder god to global audiences, though the historical Thor would probably be confused by his clean-shaven look and the notable absence of drinking, boasting, and cross-dressing, all activities the mythological Thor engaged in with enthusiasm. These pop culture Vikings generally sport impractical leather armor, historically inaccurate horned helmets, and inexplicably perfect teeth, because nothing ruins an epic battle scene like stopping to floss. Beyond entertainment, practical experiments in Viking shipbuilding and navigation continue to test the capabilities of Norse exploration technology. Modern recreations of Viking vessels have successfully crossed the Atlantic, proving the seaworthiness of these ancient designs. The Danish Havingsten fra Glendalough, sea stallion from Glendalough, a reconstruction of a longship found at Roskilde, sailed from Denmark to Dublin in 2007, with a volunteer crew experiencing firsthand the challenges of Viking Age seafaring, though presumably with better dental care and fewer opportunities for plunder along the way. Here's a quirky tidbit about Viking linguistic legacy. Every time you say Thursday, you're honoring Thor, as the day is literally Thor's Day. Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday similarly pay tribute to Norse gods Tyr, Odin, Woden, and Frigg. The word berserk comes directly from those terrifying bear-shirt warriors. Ransack, knife, skull, husband, window, and dozens of other common English words have Norse origins. Perhaps most appropriately, the nautical term starboard comes from the Old Norse stjornbor, the side of the ship where the steering oar was mounted. Even our modern navigation terminology has Viking DNA. Viking heritage tourism has become a major industry across Northern Europe. You can visit reconstructed longhouses, marvel at preserved ships in museums from Oslo to Roskilde, or attend Viking festivals where modern enthusiasts demonstrate ancient crafts, combat techniques, and cooking methods. Iceland's Settlement Museum in Reykjavik uses cutting-edge technology to bring the Viking Age to life, while LanceEux Meadows in Newfoundland lets visitors stand on the precise spot where Norse explorers first set foot in North America. These sites attract millions of visitors annually, though the gift shops sadly lack authentic Viking souvenirs like, "I raided Lindisfarne and all I got was this lousy monastic manuscript," t-shirts. Historians still argue about the true nature and extent of Viking innovation in navigation, shipbuilding, and exploration techniques. Some scholars view the Norse as revolutionary innovators who developed unique solutions to the challenges of North Atlantic navigation, while others suggest they largely adapted and refined existing technologies from earlier maritime cultures. The debate essentially centers on whether we should view Vikings as technological revolutionaries or particularly successful adapters and combiners of existing knowledge, whether they were the Steve Jobs of medieval seafaring, creating something that seemed magical through innovative design, or more like skilled systems integrators who excelled at putting existing pieces together in particularly effective ways. What's undeniable is that the Viking spirit of exploration established a template for later European expansion across the globe. The same combination of economic pressure, technological innovation, and cultural daring that sent Norse ships across the Atlantic would later drive the age of exploration, when European vessels would venture around Africa, across the Pacific, and eventually circumnavigate the entire planet. The Vikings may have been the first Europeans to reach North America, but their greater legacy was demonstrating that the seemingly impassable ocean could become a highway rather than a barrier, a fundamental shift in perspective that would eventually reshape the entire world. As you settle deeper into your pillow, imagine yourself on the shore of a fjord over 1,000 years ago, watching a dragon-headed ship disappear over the horizon. The crew has no GPS, no weather forecasts, no certain knowledge of what awaits them. Only courage, skill, and a willingness to venture into the unknown. This Viking spirit of exploration, the drive to discover what lies beyond the next wave, the next headland, the next horizon, remains perhaps their most important legacy. From those wooden longships to modern spacecraft venturing toward distant planets, the fundamental human desire to explore continues unabated, connecting us across the centuries to those remarkable Norse mariners who first showed what was possible when human ingenuity confronted the vast, uncharted ocean. As your thoughts drift like a ship on gentle currents, consider how the Viking saga connects to your own life's journey. We may not face the physical challenges of those ancient explorers, but we still navigate uncertainty, seek new horizons, and occasionally need the courage to venture into our own unknown territories. The world grows quieter now, the mental images of longships and northern lights becoming softer, more dreamlike. The splashing of oars against cold northern waters fades to a gentle rhythm, like waves caressing a distant shore or perhaps your own steady breathing as you float on the edge of sleep. Those Norse explorers who once sailed through storm and darkness have completed their voyages, their dragon ships long since returned to the earth, their stories preserved in sagas and in the genetic heritage of populations across half the world. Their restless spirit of discovery, however, continues to echo across time, whispering to us still of distant horizons and the quiet satisfaction of journeying beyond known boundaries, of finding new shores through courage and determination. As your consciousness ebbs like a retreating tide, imagine yourself beneath the same stars that guided those ancient mariners, connected through time to their journeys, drifting now toward your own peaceful harbor of dreams.